Standing in my childhood kitchen birthday cake half eaten on the counter, I watched the man I called Dad for 18 years transform into a stranger. His words cut deeper than any blade. Happy birthday to another man's mistake. The room fell silent except for Mom's sharp intake of breath. But what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family love and revenge. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, a man with my exact eyes stood there holding legal documents that would expose decades of lies and launch the most satisfying revenge story of my life. Before we dive into this wild family drama, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're ready for a story about family betrayal, shocking discoveries, and justice served cold, smash that like button and hit subscribe because this revenge tale will blow your mind. Trust me, you won't see the ending coming. My name is Scarlett, and until 3 hours ago, I believed Richard Hayes was my biological father. Sure, we never looked alike. His blonde hair and blue eyes versus my dark auburn curls and green eyes. But Mom always said I took after her side. What I didn't know was that her side meant someone else entirely. The birthday dinner started normally enough. Mom made my favorite lasagna. Richard grumbled about the expense of my upcoming college tuition, and my younger brother Jake showed me his latest video game achievements. Everything felt routine until Mom disappeared to take a phone call that lasted 20 minutes. When she returned, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. Richard noticed immediately. "Who was that, Linda?" "Nobody important," she whispered, but her voice cracked on the words. Richard's expression darkened. He'd been drinking since lunch, celebrating what he called finally getting rid of the financial burden once I moved out for college. The comment stung, but I was used to his casual cruelty by now. "Don't lie to me," he snarled, grabbing Mom's phone from the counter. His face went white as he scrolled through her messages. 18 years. 18 goddamn years, and he wants to see her now. I felt the blood drain from my face. "See who? What are you talking about?" Richard laughed, but it was an ugly sound filled with malice. "Tell her, Linda. Tell your precious daughter the truth about her real daddy." Mom started crying, then ugly sobs that shook her whole body. "Richard, please not like this." "Not like what?" He was shouting now, his face red with rage and alcohol. "Not on her birthday." "Well, tough shit. It's time she knew exactly what she cost me." He turned to me with eyes full of hatred I'd never seen before. "You want to know why I never loved you, Scarlett? Why I could barely stand to look at you all these years? Because every time I see your face, I see his. Every dollar I spent on you, every birthday party, every Christmas present, all of it was for another man's mistake." The words hit me like physical blows. Jake had gone silent in the corner, his video game forgotten. Mom was still crying, but she managed to whisper, "She's not a mistake. Don't you dare call her that." "She's the reason you married me," Richard screamed. "Pregnant with another man's baby, desperate for a father figure, and I was stupid enough to fall for your sob story. 18 years of supporting a kid who isn't mine. 18 years of pretending to be a family." My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to stand straighter. "Who is he? Who's my real father?" Richard's smile was cruel. "Some hotshot lawyer from Boston, James Morrison. Your mother's little secret from before she trapped me into this mess." The name meant nothing to me, but the way Mom's face crumpled told me everything. This wasn't some random fling, this was someone important, someone she'd loved. "Where is he now?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Probably living his best life without the burden of knowing about you," Richard spat. "But apparently someone told him about his little bastard, and now he's sniffing around like a dog in heat." That's when I realized what the phone call had been about. My real father, James Morrison, somehow knew about me and wanted to meet. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. Someone had told him it was my 18th birthday. The doorbell, I whispered, remembering the sound from earlier. That was him, wasn't it? Mom nodded through her tears. He's been waiting outside for an hour. I told him. I told him you needed time to process this. Richard's laughter was bitter and harsh. Perfect. Just perfect. The golden boy lawyer wants to play daddy now that all the hard work is done. 18 years too late, but sure let him swoop in and be the hero. I felt something shift inside me, not just confusion or hurt, but anger. Pure, righteous anger. Not at my biological father for not knowing, but at Richard for making my entire childhood a punishment for circumstances beyond my control, for making me feel unwanted and unloved when it had nothing to do with who I was as a person. "You're right," I said quietly, and Richard looked surprised by my agreement. 18 years is a long time. Long enough to build a family, to create bonds, to show love and support. I paused, letting the words sink in. Too bad you wasted every single one of those years making sure I knew I wasn't wanted. Richard's face flushed darker. Ungrateful little... I'm not finished. I cut him off, and something in my tone made him stop. You want to talk about mistakes. The biggest mistake was you choosing to punish an innocent child for adult decisions, but that's about to change. I walked to the front door, my heart pounding, but my resolve steel strong. Through the frosted glass, I could see a tall figure waiting on our porch. This was it, the moment that would change everything. But as my hand touched the doorknob, I realized something that made me pause. If James Morrison was really a successful lawyer, and if he'd just learned about me, then there were probably legal implications to consider. Child support inheritance rights, the legitimacy of Richard's claim as my legal father. The pieces were falling into place, and I was starting to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about meeting my real father. This was about justice for 18 years of emotional abuse and financial manipulation. I opened the door to find a man who looked like an older male version of myself staring back at me. James Morrison was tall and distinguished with the same auburn hair, now graying at the temples, and identical green eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. He was holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression of nervous hope that made my chest tight. "Scarlett!" His voice was warm and careful, like he was afraid I might disappear if he spoke too loudly. "That depends," I said, stepping onto the porch and closing the door behind me. "Are you here to pay 18 years of back child support, or just to ease your conscience?" His eyebrows shot up at my directness, but instead of being offended, he smiled the same lopsided smile I saw in the mirror every morning. "Straight to the point. I like that. And to answer your question, both, actually." From inside the house, I could hear Richard's voice rising again, probably berating Mom for the situation. James's expression darkened as he caught the angry tone through the walls. "He's been like this your whole life, hasn't he?" It wasn't really a question. I studied his face carefully. "How long have you known about me?" 3 weeks, he said quietly. "A private investigator I hired to find your mother finally tracked her down. I've been looking for Linda for 19 years. The admission hit me like a truck. 19 years. You've been looking for my mom for 19 years. James nodded, his hands tightening on the envelope. "We were together in college. I was a senior, she was a sophomore. We were planning to get married after I graduated law school, but then..." He ran a hand through his hair. "My father died suddenly, and I had to go back to Boston to handle his estate. It was supposed to be temporary, just a few weeks. But it wasn't, I guessed. No, the estate was a mess tied up in lawsuits that took months to resolve. I called and wrote letters, but Linda had moved out of her dorm. Her roommate said she'd dropped out, but no one knew where she'd gone. I hired investigators then too, but they came up empty. I felt a chill run down my spine. She disappeared on purpose. I think so, and I think I know why. He handed me the envelope. There's something you need to see before we go any further. Inside were copies of legal documents, bank statements, and what looked like correspondence between lawyers. But the document on top made my blood run cold, a copy of Richard's and Mom's marriage certificate dated just 2 months before my birth. This doesn't make sense, I whispered. If they got married 2 months before I was born and you're my father— Keep reading, James said gently. The next document was a copy of my birth certificate. Under father, Richard's name was listed, but there was a notation in the margin I'd never seen before, an amendment filed when I was 6 years old. He legally adopted you, James explained. But here's the thing, Scarlett. He was never your biological father, and he knew it from the day you were born. My hands were shaking as I flipped to the next document, a paternity test dated just 1 week after my birth. The results were clear. Richard Hayes was not my biological father. How did you get these? I asked, my voice barely audible. I'm a lawyer, remember? And more importantly, I specialize in family law and paternity cases. When I finally found your mother 3 weeks ago, I also found some very interesting public records. His expression hardened. Richard Hayes has been claiming you as a dependent on his taxes for 18 years, collecting child tax credits and even claiming education credits he wasn't entitled to. But that's not the worst part. I looked up at him, dreading what came next. There's a trust fund, Scarlett. My father left money specifically for any grandchildren, and I've been setting aside money for you since the day you were born, even though I didn't know where you were. Richard has known about me this whole time, and he's known about the money. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. That's why he kept me. Not out of love or duty, but because I was worth something to him financially. I believe so, and I think your mother knows it too. As if summoned by our conversation, the front door opened and Mom stepped outside. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she looked older than I'd ever seen her. James, she whispered, and there was so much pain in that single word. Hello, Linda. His voice was carefully neutral, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. I can explain, she started, but James held up a hand. Actually, I think Scarlett deserves to hear the whole truth first. Don't you? Mom's face crumpled again, but she nodded. I was scared, Jamie. When you left for Boston, I found out I was pregnant and I panicked. Your family had money expectations. I was just a scholarship kid from a small town. I thought you'd feel trapped. So you trapped someone else instead. The words came out harsher than I intended, but I was beyond caring about being polite. Richard seemed safe, she whispered. He was older, stable, said he wanted a family. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. Except for me, I said flatly. And except for James, who spent 19 years wondering what happened to the woman he loved. James stepped closer to me, and I caught a whiff of expensive cologne mixed with something that smelled like home. Scarlett, I want you to know that if I had known about you, I would have been here. Every birthday, every Christmas, every moment you needed a father, I would have been here. The sincerity in his voice broke something loose in my chest, but before I could respond, Richard burst through the front door. His face was flushed with rage and alcohol, and he was clutching a beer bottle like a weapon. Get off my property, he snarled at James. You have no right to be here. James stepped protectively in front of me, and something in his posture changed. This wasn't just the gentleman who'd been talking to his daughter. This was a lawyer who'd been pushed too far. Actually, Richard, I have every right to be here. Scarlett is my daughter, and I've been paying for her support through a trust fund that you've been illegally intercepting for years. Richard's face went white, then red again. That's bullshit! You can't prove anything! James pulled out his phone and showed Richard the screen. I can prove everything. Bank records, tax fraud, identity theft. Should I go on? You've been committing federal crimes for 18 years, and I have all the documentation to prove it. The beer bottle slipped from Richard's hand and shattered on the concrete. You can't. There's no way. There's absolutely a way, James said calmly. I've been building this case for 3 weeks. The IRS is very interested in your tax returns, and the state attorney general wants to discuss your fraudulent claims for education credits. Oh, and the bank that's been holding Scarlett's trust fund. They're not very happy that you've been forging documents to access money that was never yours. I stared at James in amazement. In 3 weeks, he'd not only found me, but had built a legal case that could send Richard to prison. This wasn't just a father meeting his daughter. This was a calculated takedown, 18 years in the making. Richard seemed to realize this too. His bluster deflated, and suddenly he looked smaller, older, afraid. What do you want? He asked quietly. James smiled, but it wasn't a kind expression. Justice, Richard. Pure and simple justice. The next morning, I sat in James's downtown law office surrounded by mahogany furniture and law books that probably cost more than Richard's car. The contrast between my old life and this glimpse of what my life could have been was staggering. Coffee, James asked, gesturing to an expensive-looking machine in the corner. Please. I needed caffeine to process everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. After Richard's meltdown on the porch, James had insisted I pack a bag and stay at a hotel for the night. Family confrontations can escalate quickly, he'd explained, especially when financial crimes are involved. He'd been right. According to the text messages from Jake that morning, Richard had spent the night raging through the house, throwing things, and threatening to make that bastard pay for ruining his family. Mom had locked herself in their bedroom and hadn't come out. I've been thinking about our conversation last night, James said, handing me a steaming mug. And I have a proposition for you. I raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Richard has committed multiple federal crimes over the past 18 years. Tax fraud, identity theft, mail fraud related to the trust fund documents, the list goes on. I could have him arrested today. But I sensed there was more to this. But I think there's a better way to handle this. A way that gets you justice and also protects your mother and Jake from the fallout. He pulled out a thick folder and spread documents across his desk. I want to offer you something Richard never did a choice in how we proceed. For the next hour, James laid out 3 different strategies. Option 1 was immediate prosecution, which would likely result in Richard going to prison, but would also mean financial devastation for Mom and Jake. Option 2 was a civil lawsuit that would recover the stolen trust fund money, but might take years to resolve. Option 3 was what James called strategic pressure. We build an airtight case document, everything, and then we give Richard a choice, James explained. He can make restitution, agree to a divorce that protects your mother, and sign away any legal claim to you, or we hand everything over to the authorities. That sounds almost too easy, I said skeptically. James smiled grimly. Oh, it won't be easy. Men like Richard don't give up control without a fight. That's where the alliance building comes in. He opened another folder revealing what looked like investigative reports. I've had my team doing some digging into Richard's background. He's not just a deadbeat father Scarlett. He's got a pattern of financial manipulation and emotional abuse that goes back decades. The first report was about Richard's previous marriage before Mom. His first wife, Patricia, had filed for divorce, citing financial abuse and emotional cruelty. She'd gotten almost nothing in the settlement because Richard had hidden assets and manipulated their joint finances. Patricia Chin. I started to read, but James interrupted. Actually, she goes by Patricia Williams now. She remarried and has been living quietly in Oregon for the past 20 years. But here's the interesting part: she's been paying into a fund for victims of financial abuse. My pulse quickened. She'd help us. I reached out to her yesterday. She's been waiting 20 years for someone to hold Richard accountable. She's not just willing to help, she's eager. The second report was even more damaging. Richard had been systematically stealing from his own mother's estate when she developed dementia. His brother David had suspected the theft but couldn't prove it before their mother died. David lives in California now, James continued. He's a CPA, and when I explained what Richard had done to you and your trust fund, he offered to help us trace the financial records. I was beginning to see the scope of what James had planned. This wasn't just about my case. This was about exposing a pattern of abuse that had affected multiple families over decades. There's one more person I want you to meet, James said, picking up his phone. Someone who might be the key to everything. 20 minutes later, a woman in her 50s walked into the office. She was professionally dressed with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of a favorite high school teacher. Scarlett, I'd like you to meet Detective Sarah Martinez. She specializes in financial crimes and domestic abuse cases. Detective Martinez shook my hand with a firm grip. Your father, she paused, glancing at James. Biological father has shared some very interesting information with me. If even half of what he's documented is accurate, Richard Hayes has been running financial scams for decades. She sat down and opened her own file. The thing about men like Richard is that they don't limit their crimes to one family. They're usually running multiple cons simultaneously. What do you mean? I asked. We've been tracking a series of tax fraud cases in this area, and Richard's name has come up as a person of interest in 3 separate investigations. But we never had enough evidence to build a case until now. James leaned forward. The trust fund fraud gives us the smoking gun we need to open up all the other cases. But Sarah needs someone on the inside to help document Richard's current activities. I felt a chill of understanding. You want me to go back home and spy on him? Not spy exactly, Detective Martinez said carefully. Just observe, document. If Richard is still actively committing fraud, which I suspect he is, we need evidence of ongoing criminal activity. The idea terrified me, but it also felt like justice. After 18 years of being Richard's victim, I could finally be part of taking him down. What about my mom and Jake? I asked. I can't put them in danger. James reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. That's why we're building this alliance, Scarlett. Patricia has agreed to reach out to your mother directly, woman, to help her understand what Richard really is. David is going to help us trace the financial records to build an airtight case. Detective Martinez is going to make sure everything we do is legal and by the book. And you? I asked. I'm going to be the father I should have been 18 years ago. I'm going to protect you, support you, and make sure Richard never hurts our family again. The word family hit me like a physical force. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I was wanted and protected. There's something else, James said, pulling out one final document. The trust fund your grandfather set up. It's worth more than just the monthly payments Richard's been stealing. There's a lump sum that becomes available when you turn 18. He slid the paper across to me, and I nearly choked on my coffee when I saw the number. $250,000, I whispered. That's just the trust fund, James said quietly. There's also college money, and I've been setting aside funds for 18 years. Scarlett, you're not just free from Richard financially, you're financially independent. The magnitude of what Richard had stolen from me, not just money, but freedom, choices. A relationship with my real father hit me like a tsunami. But alongside the grief was something else: power. For the first time in my life, I had real power to change my circumstances and protect the people I loved. "When do we start?" I asked. Detective Martinez smiled. "We already have. Patricia is meeting with your mother this afternoon. David is flying in tomorrow to go through Richard's financial records. And James has filed the preliminary paperwork to establish paternity and start the process of recovering your stolen funds." "What about Richard?" I asked. James's expression hardened. "Richard is about to discover that the frightened little girl he's been tormenting for 18 years has grown up, and she's brought reinforcements." As I left the law office that afternoon, armed with recording devices and a detailed plan, I felt like I was walking into battle. But for the first time in my life, I knew I was going to win. 3 days into our operation, everything was going perfectly. Patricia had convinced Mom to open a separate bank account and start documenting Richard's financial abuse. David had arrived from California and was systematically photographing Richard's hidden documents while he was at work. Detective Martinez had enough evidence to start formal proceedings. Then Jake called me sobbing. "Scarlett, you have to come home right now," he whispered into the phone. "Mom's in the hospital." My blood turned to ice. "What happened?" "Richard found out about the bank account. He lost it completely. Started throwing things, screaming about how everyone was conspiring against him. Mom tried to calm him down and Jake's voice broke. "He pushed her down the stairs." I was already grabbing my keys. "Is she okay?" "Broken wrist and some bruises. The doctors say she'll be fine, but Scarlett—" Jake's voice dropped even lower. "He's blaming you for everything. He keeps saying if you hadn't brought that lawyer into our lives, none of this would have happened." 20 minutes later, I was rushing through the hospital corridors with James close behind me. We found Mom in the emergency room, her left arm in a cast and her face swollen with bruises that made my stomach turn. "Honey," she whispered when she saw me and started crying again. "I'm so sorry. I should have left him years ago." "This is not your fault," I said firmly, taking her good hand. "Where is he now?" "Home, I think. Jake called the police, but Richard told them I fell down the stairs, said I'd been drinking." Mom's voice was bitter. "Jake tried to tell them the truth, but Richard convinced them it was just a family disagreement that got out of hand." James stepped forward, his face grim. "Linda, we need to talk about getting you and Jake somewhere safe. This level of violence means Richard is escalating." That's when Patricia walked into the room, and I knew immediately something was wrong. Her face was pale, and she couldn't meet my eyes. "Patricia." I stood up slowly. "What's wrong?" She looked around nervously, then pulled out her phone. "I got a call an hour ago, from Richard." My heart sank. "What kind of call?" "He knows everything, Scarlett. He knows about the investigation, the alliance, all of it." Patricia's voice was shaking. "He said he has evidence that James has been manipulating you, that this whole thing is about money, not justice." James stepped forward. "That's impossible. The only people who knew the full scope were—" "David," Patricia whispered, and the name hit the room like a bomb. "What about David?" I asked, though I was starting to understand. "Richard got to him, offered him something." Patricia's hands were trembling as she showed us her phone. "David's been feeding Richard information about our plans from the beginning." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. David Richard's own brother, the man who'd supposedly wanted justice for their mother's stolen estate, he'd been working against us the entire time. "There's more," Patricia continued miserably. "Richard has documentation that makes it look like James only found you because he was trying to avoid paying back taxes on his father's estate. He's going to claim James manufactured this whole paternity story to access trust fund money that doesn't legally belong to him." I stared at James, searching his face for any sign that this might be true. "Is there any way that could work?" James's jaw was tight with anger, but his voice was steady. Legally, no. The paternity test is ironclad and the financial records speak for themselves. But Richard doesn't need to win in court scarlet. He just needs to create enough doubt to discredit our case. What does he want? I asked Patricia. She pulled out a piece of paper with Richard's handwriting on it. He wants you to drop all charges, return any money James has given you, and publicly state that you made false accusations against him. In exchange, he'll allow your mother to divorce him and keep custody of Jake. The ultimatum was cruel in its simplicity. Richard was betting that I'd choose my family's immediate safety over long-term justice. And if I don't agree, he files countercharges against James for fraud and manipulation of a minor. He claims you're emotionally unstable due to parental abandonment issues, and he fights for custody of Jake based on your mother's inability to protect her children from dangerous outside influences. I felt sick. In one move, Richard had turned our entire alliance against us. David's betrayal had given him inside information about our strategy, and now he was using it to back us into a corner. There's something else, Patricia said quietly. David told Richard about the recording devices and the documentation we've been gathering. Richard's had time to destroy evidence and prepare counter-evidence that makes us look like the criminals. James was pacing now, his lawyer mind working through the implications. This is salvageable. The core evidence, the trust fund theft, the tax fraud that can't be fabricated away. But it can be delayed. Detective Martinez's voice came from the doorway. She'd arrived while we were talking and had been listening to everything. Richard's lawyer, and apparently he's hired a good one, filed an injunction this afternoon. They're claiming James is using coercive tactics on a vulnerable teenager, and they want all evidence gathered through our operation to be declared inadmissible. The room fell silent except for the beeping of Mom's heart monitor. Everything we'd worked for, everything we'd built, was crumbling around us. How long do we have? I asked quietly. Richard wants an answer by tomorrow morning, Patricia said. Otherwise, he starts making his accusations public and filing his countersuits. I looked around the room at the adults who'd promised to help me get Justice James, who'd found me only to potentially lose me again. Patricia, who'd risked her own peace to help a stranger. Detective Martinez, whose investigation was falling apart. And Mom lying broken in a hospital bed because she'd tried to escape an abusive marriage. Richard had won. Again. But as I sat there feeling defeated, something else started growing in my chest. Not despair rage. Pure, focused rage at a system that allowed men like Richard to manipulate and abuse for decades without consequences. No, I said quietly. Everyone looked at me. No, no. I repeated louder this time. I'm not accepting his ultimatum. I don't care what Richard threatens or what David told him or what lawyers he's hired. I'm 18 years old and I'm done being afraid of him. James sat down beside me. Scarlett, I understand how you feel, but we need to be realistic about... I am being realistic. I cut him off. Realistically, Richard is going to keep hurting people until someone stops him. Realistically, if we back down now, he'll know he can get away with anything. And realistically, I'd rather fight and lose than surrender and guarantee he wins. I stood up and faced the room full of adults who'd underestimated both Richard's cunning and my own determination. David betrayed us because Richard got to him first. Fine. Patricia's scared because Richard threatened her. Understandable. The legal system is going to protect an abusive man over his victims. Not surprising. I paused, looking each of them in the eye. But none of that changes the fact that Richard is a criminal who's been stealing from and abusing people for decades. What are you suggesting? Detective Martinez asked. I smiled, and I knew it probably looked a little scary. I'm suggesting we stop playing Richard's game and start playing our own. That night, I did something I'd never done before in my 18 years of life. I took control. While everyone else was debating legal strategies and damage control, I went back to Richard's house alone. Not to confront him, but to do what I should have done from the beginning, gather evidence he didn't know existed. Richard was passed out drunk on the couch when I let myself in with my old key. Jake was hiding in his room, and the house bore the evidence of Richard's earlier rampage: broken dishes, holes in the walls, family photos scattered across the floor. I found Jake curled up on his bed, still fully clothed. "Scarlett." He sat up quickly. "What are you doing here? If Richard wakes up—" "He won't," I said quietly. "And even if he does, I'm not afraid of him anymore." I sat on the edge of Jake's bed and really looked at my little brother for the first time in days. He had dark circles under his eyes and his hands were shaking slightly, classic signs of someone living in a constant state of fear. "Jake, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest with me." He nodded. "Has Richard ever hurt you? Not just yelled at you or been mean, but actually put his hands on you?" Jake's face crumpled, and I had my answer before he even spoke. "He said if I told anyone, he'd send me away. Said no one would believe me because he's not even my real dad." The admission hit me like a freight train. Richard had been abusing Jake too, and I'd been so focused on my own suffering that I'd missed it. "Show me," I said gently. Jake pulled up his shirt to reveal bruises on his ribs that were in various stages of healing. Some fresh from today, others faded yellow and green. This wasn't a one-time incident. This was systematic abuse that had been going on for months, maybe years. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures documenting each bruise. "Jake, I'm going to get you out of here, I promise. But first, I need you to help me with something." For the next hour, Jake and I methodically went through Richard's home office. Jake knew Richard's hiding spots: the loose floorboard where he kept cash, the false bottom in his desk drawer where he stored financial documents. He didn't want Mom to see the shoebox in the back of his closet where he kept important papers. What we found was devastating. Richard had been running an insurance scam for years, claiming fake injuries and collecting disability payments while working under the table. He'd been stealing from his employer by submitting false expense reports. Most damning of all, he'd been systematically draining bank accounts belonging to elderly clients at the financial services company where he worked. But the document that made my blood run cold was a handwritten note in Richard's writing. "If Linda tries to leave, threaten custody of Jake. If James Morrison causes problems, use David's information to discredit. Scarlett is 18, no legal hold over her, but she won't abandon her family." Richard had been planning his counterattack from the moment James appeared at our door. David's betrayal wasn't spontaneous, it was orchestrated from the beginning. "He's been planning this for weeks," Jake whispered, reading over my shoulder. "Longer than that," I said, photographing every document. "Look at this." I showed Jake a folder labeled Morrison that contained newspaper clippings about James's law firm, copies of documents related to the trust fund, and what looked like surveillance photos of James's office building. Richard had been tracking James for months, maybe even years. This wasn't a desperate man reacting to unexpected events. This was a predator who'd been preparing for this confrontation. "We need to get out of here," Jake said nervously. "If he wakes up." "He's not going to wake up," said a voice from the doorway, and we both spun around in terror. But instead of Richard, we found a woman I didn't recognize. She was about 40, professionally dressed with intelligent eyes and an air of authority that immediately commanded respect. "Who are you?" I demanded, stepping protectively in front of Jake. "Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI Financial Crimes Division," she said, showing us her badge. "And you must be Scarlett Hayes. We need to talk." My mind reeled. "FBI? How did you—" Detective Martinez contacted us yesterday when she realized the scope of what Richard's been doing. Financial crimes that cross state lines fall under federal jurisdiction, and Richard Hayes has been on our radar for quite a while. Agent Torres stepped into the room and quickly assessed the documents we'd spread across Jake's bed. I see you've been doing some investigating of your own. Richard's been planning his defense for weeks, I said, handing her the folder with James's information. His brother David has been feeding him information about our investigation. We know about David, Agent Torres said grimly. He approached us 3 days ago trying to cut a deal. Apparently, Richard has been blackmailing him over some financial irregularities in California. David's been working with us to document Richard's activities. I stared at her. David's been working with the FBI. David never betrayed you, Scarlett. We asked him to feed Richard false information to make him overconfident. Everything Richard thinks he knows about James's supposed vulnerabilities, it's fabricated. The revelation hit me like a tidal wave. David wasn't a traitor. He was an undercover ally who'd been playing a role to help us build a stronger case. Richard's ultimatum, his threats, his counter-evidence, all based on false information David fed him at our request. Agent Torres confirmed. We've been documenting his criminal activities for weeks now, and tomorrow morning we're executing search warrants on his workplace, his bank accounts in this house. Jake grabbed my arm. Does that mean? It means Richard's going to prison for a very long time, Agent Torres said. Federal charges for mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, and now, thanks to what you've documented tonight, aggravated assault and child abuse. I felt something that had been clenched tight in my chest for 18 years finally begin to loosen. This was really happening. Richard was going to face consequences for everything he'd done. What about his threats against James? I asked. Agent Torres smiled. Richard can't file false charges against James when he's in federal custody, and even if he tried, we have documented evidence that Richard has been planning to frame James for months. Any accusations he makes now will be seen as desperate attempts to shift blame. There's something else you should know, Agent Torres continued. The trust fund money Richard stole, we've traced it through multiple accounts. He spent most of it on gambling and high-end purchases, but we can recover a significant portion through asset seizure. She handed me an official-looking document. This is a federal asset protection order. As of tonight, you have legal access to the remaining trust fund money plus additional compensation for the years of theft. I stared at the numbers on the page. Not only was I getting back what Richard had stolen, but the federal penalties meant I was actually going to receive more than the original trust fund amount. When does this all happen? Jake asked quietly. The arrests happen at 6 a.m. tomorrow, Agent Torres said. I'd recommend you and your brother stay somewhere else tonight. Your mother is safe at the hospital, and we'll have agents posted there as well. As we prepared to leave Richard's house for the last time, Jake tugged on my sleeve. Scarlett, does this mean we're really free? I looked around the house where I'd spent 18 years feeling unwanted and afraid. Tomorrow, Richard would wake up in handcuffs facing decades in federal prison. Mom would be safe to start over without fear. Jake would never have to hide bruises again. Yeah, Jake, I said, putting my arm around my little brother. We're really free. Agent Torres was waiting by the door with one final piece of news. Scarlett, there's someone waiting outside who's been very patient while we handled the legal preliminaries. I looked out the front window to see James standing by his car, holding what looked like college brochures and a bouquet of flowers. He's been waiting out there for 3 hours, Agent Torres said with a smile. Apparently, he has 18 years of birthday presents to make up for. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse lobby reading the final sentencing documents. Richard Hayes, 15 years federal prison for financial crimes, plus additional state charges for domestic violence and child abuse. No possibility of parole for the first 8 years. Jake appeared beside me, taller now and with color back in his cheeks. Is it really over? It's really over. I confirmed, folding the papers and putting them in my purse. The transformation in our family had been remarkable. Mom had filed for divorce the day after Richard's arrest and was already dating someone new, a gentle man named Tom who taught elementary school and made her laugh in ways I'd never seen before. She'd also started therapy to deal with the years of abuse and was working part-time at a domestic violence shelter helping other women escape situations like hers. Jake was thriving in counseling and had started playing guitar again, something Richard had forbidden because it was too loud. He'd also grown 3 inches once the constant stress was removed from his life, as if his body had finally felt safe enough to develop normally. As for me, I was finishing my freshman year at Boston University, living in an apartment near James's house. Not with him, we'd both agreed I needed space to figure out who I was outside of Richard's shadow, but close enough that we had dinner twice a week and he could drive me to campus when Boston traffic was particularly brutal. Building a relationship with James had been surreal but wonderful. He was everything Richard wasn't: patient, encouraging, genuinely interested in my thoughts and dreams. He'd been setting aside money for my education since the day I was born, and when I'd protested that it was too much, he'd simply said, "I have 18 years of father-daughter bonding to make up for. Let me start with making sure you graduate debt-free." The best part was that James never tried to replace the family I'd built with Mom and Jake. Instead, he'd embraced them both. He'd helped Mom find a good divorce lawyer, paid for Jake's therapy, and had even offered Jake a summer job at his law firm when he turned 16. "Scarlett!" Patricia's voice called from across the lobby. She approached with David close behind her, both of them grinning. The relationship between Patricia and David had been an unexpected bonus from this whole ordeal. Both of them had been isolated by Richard's abuse in different ways, and they'd found healing in supporting each other through the legal proceedings. They weren't dating. Patricia was clear that she wasn't ready for that, but they'd become close friends who understood each other's experiences. "How does it feel?" David asked, gesturing toward the courtroom where Richard had just received his final sentencing. "Anticlimactic, honestly," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel more triumphant, but mostly I just feel relieved." Agent Torres joined our group looking satisfied. "The financial recovery is complete," she announced. "Richard's remaining assets have been liquidated and the restitution payments are being processed. Between the trust fund recovery, the federal compensation, and the civil settlement you're looking at, about $400,000. The money still felt surreal. I'd grown up believing we were barely scraping by, but it turned out Richard had been stealing and hoarding money for years. The financial security meant I could focus on school without worrying about student loans, and I'd already set aside money for Jake's college education. "There's something else," Agent Torres continued. "The investigation into Richard's activities led us to uncover a larger financial fraud ring. 3 other men have been arrested, and we've identified 17 additional victims. The case you built by documenting everything so carefully, it's helped us shut down a criminal network that was operating across 4 states. I felt a surge of pride, not just because Richard was facing consequences, but because our fight had protected other families from going through what we'd endured. "Speaking of documentation," James said, pulling out an envelope, "I have something for you." Inside was a letter from Richard, written from federal prison. My first instinct was to throw it away, unread, but James stopped me. "Read it first," he said gently. "You might be surprised." The letter was only 1 page, written in Richard's careful handwriting. "Scarlett, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not writing this to make excuses for what I did. I spent 18 years punishing you for circumstances that were never your fault, and I robbed you of the childhood and father you deserved. I also hurt Linda and Jake, and I can never undo that damage. I don't expect you to respond to this letter or ever think about me again. I just wanted you to know that my actions were never about who you are as a person. You were a good kid who deserved better than what I gave you. I hope your real father can provide the love and support I was too broken to offer. Take care of Jake and your mother. They're lucky to have you." The letter surprised me. Not because it changed how I felt about Richard, it didn't, but because it felt like a genuine acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused. There was no self-pity, no attempts to justify his behavior, no requests for forgiveness or contact. "How do you feel about it?" James asked carefully. "Like it's too little too late," I said honestly. But also like maybe he finally understands what he did. I don't forgive him and I don't want a relationship with him, but I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. But I'm glad he knows that what he did was wrong. Jake read the letter over my shoulder. "Do you think he means it?" "I think it doesn't matter," I said, putting my arm around my brother. "Whether Richard means it or not doesn't change the fact that we're better off without him." As we left the courthouse, I reflected on how much had changed in 6 months. I'd gained a father-uncovered family I didn't know existed, helped send a criminal to prison, and most importantly, learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. The best part wasn't the money or the justice, or even the relationship with James. The best part was the family we'd chosen to build together. James, who'd waited 19 years to find us, and now treated Mom like a beloved sister, and Jake like the son he'd never had. Patricia and David, who'd become honorary aunt and uncle figures in our lives. Detective Martinez and Agent Torres, who'd gone above and beyond their professional duties to make sure we got justice. Even Mom's new boyfriend, Tom, had seamlessly joined our unconventional family unit, bringing homemade cookies to our weekly dinners and teaching Jake guitar chords. "Want to grab dinner?" James asked as we reached the parking lot. "Tom's making his famous lasagna, and Patricia promised to bring that chocolate cake Jake likes." "Family dinner sounds perfect," I said, and for the first time in my life, the word family felt like a warm hug instead of a burden. As we drove toward James's house where our chosen family was waiting with dinner and laughter and unconditional love, I realized something profound. Richard had spent 18 years trying to convince me I was unwanted and unworthy of love. But in the end, his cruelty had led me to discover just how many people were willing to fight for me, protect me, and claim me as their own. That night, surrounded by the family I'd chosen and who had chosen me back, I understood that the best revenge wasn't Richard going to prison, though that was satisfying. The best revenge was building a life so full of love and support that his years of abuse became just a small, ugly chapter in a much larger, beautiful story. Sometimes karma doesn't come as swift justice. Sometimes it comes as the slow, steady realization that the people who tried to break you actually led you to the exact people who were meant to love you all along. You know, sharing this story with all of you has been incredibly healing, and I hope it helps someone else who might be dealing with family betrayal or emotional abuse. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself? How do you balance family loyalty with protecting your own well-being? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, because these situations are never black and white, and sometimes we need to hear other people's experiences to feel less alone. If this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who needs to hear it, please hit that like button and share it with them. And if you want to hear more stories about family drama, justice served, and people finding their chosen families, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Thank you all so much for listening to my journey and for being part of this incredible community. Remember that blood doesn't always make family, and family doesn't always share your blood. Choose the people who choose you back, and never let anyone convince you that you're unworthy of love. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.